The walls of Balmoral have seen centuries of secrets, but nothing quite like this. At the heart of the royal family's ancestral fortress, Princess Anne receives a private message sealed in an envelope she never wanted to open. The expression on her face shifts from confusion to devastation. In that single moment, her role, her future, and everything she believed to be secure all begin to crumble. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The call came without warning, urgent but hushed, as if even the walls of Clarence House couldn't be trusted. Anne, ever composed, was told to come to Balmoral immediately Charles had summoned her. And this time it wasn't about protocol or ceremony. There was no press briefing, no palace aides trailing behind. Just a private request cloaked in formality. Her Royal Highness is required in confidence. When she arrived, the air was thick with something unspoken. And then, in the dim quiet of the Queen's former drawing room, Charles handed her an envelope. Her name was handwritten across the front, but it wasn't his handwriting. It was hers, Elizabeth's. The wax seal bore the Queen's crest. Her mother's final message. Anne stared at it for a long time before opening it, as if she already knew that once read, nothing would be the same. When she finally broke the seal, what she saw was enough to stagger even her iron composure. The blood drained from her face. She didn't speak. She didn't demand answers. She simply folded the letter once more and clutched it to her chest. Then, without a word, she walked out. Hours passed. Edward saw her in the corridor, eyes red but jaw clenched. Sophie later confessed she had never seen Anne look that lost. No explanation was given. No one knew what the letter said, and no one dared to ask. But Balmoral staff, seasoned in royal restraint, noticed the shift. Anne cancelled her meetings, withdrew from scheduled public appearances, and stayed in her private quarters for the rest of the evening. And then the whispers began. A footman overheard one of Anne's aides mutter, "It changes everything." But what did that mean? And more importantly, what had been taken from her? It wasn't grief that filled Anne's silence. It was betrayal. Not the loss of her mother, but the unraveling of something sacred between them. Charles, too, looked uneasy. He hadn't expected this reaction. Perhaps he thought Anne would comply, remain dutiful. But he miscalculated. Because Anne had spent a lifetime earning the Queen's trust, not through ambition, but through unshakable loyalty. And whatever that letter revealed had shattered something no crown could repair. Yet she said nothing. She gave no statement. She carried her grief like armor. But what could devastate a woman known as the unbreakable spine of the monarchy? The answer lies in a secret buried deeper than anyone expected. A document long hidden, sealed by Elizabeth II herself, now re-emerges at the worst possible time. Princess Anne, once entrusted with her mother's deepest confidences, discovers a posthumous directive that reorders not just the royal legacy, but her own place within it. Days after the sealed envelope at Balmoral broke the foundations beneath Anne's feet, a second blow arrived, not in the form of memory, but mandate. Tucked deep within the late Queen's private cabinet, shielded behind ceremonial charters and royal ledgers, was a final document, one Anne had never seen. It bore the Queen's insignia, carried the weight of the sovereign seal, and was clearly marked, "Personal addendum to testament, eyes only." It wasn't Anne who found it, but a trusted legal clerk who had served the crown for over 30 years. The clerk, unsure of its current status and unsettled by the inconsistencies surfacing across palace affairs, quietly ensured the document reached Anne without interference. What she read not only stunned her, it threatened to undo everything her mother had once promised in quiet conversations and unwritten trust. This was no ceremonial token. The document outlined the Queen's desired plan for what would unfold after her death: titles, responsibilities, symbolic guardianships that would preserve the monarchy's deeper legacy beyond public-facing roles. And at the center of it was a single sacred post: Keeper of the Crown Archives. An ancient, revered position meant not merely to store royal history, but to protect it. Traditionally passed through trusted bloodlines, the role was understood to reflect more than administrative duty. It was a spiritual and moral inheritance, one meant for the daughter who had stood beside the queen through war, scandal, succession, and silence. Anne. The document, dated nearly a year before the Queen's death, left no ambiguity. Elizabeth had named Anne explicitly, noting her unparalleled dedication, her discipline, her refusal to be swayed by politics or spotlight. "Let history rest in the hands of one who has never sought to shape it," the Queen had written. But in the margins, penciled in faint script that was not the Queen's, there was another notation one Anne recognized immediately as Charles's. A terse phrase, "Directive superseded. See Amendment C." Anne froze. Later, in a private archive file that bore the amendment's reference, she found the horrifying truth. Amendment C was a newer directive, authored just 10 days before the Queen's passing while Her Majesty was bedridden, heavily sedated, and under near constant care. It named Camilla as the new keeper of the Crown Archives. No explanation, no rationale. Just a quiet overwrite of the Queen's original plan, executed through the power of the King's signature under the veil of administrative necessity. It was done legally, efficiently, but it was never what the Queen wanted. Anne wasn't shattered by the title's loss. It wasn't about protocol. It was the betrayal, the undeniable evidence that someone, somewhere, had seized her mother's intentions and twisted them into something else. It meant that Anne, who had never asked for power, had still been denied it. Not because she failed to earn it, but because someone feared what she might uncover if allowed to hold the keys to the past. And yet, as Anne grapples with this heartbreak, a second revelation emerges, one that cuts even deeper than the first. Hidden among the Queen's private effects is a cache of letters between Elizabeth and Anne, handwritten, unfiltered, and now painfully revealing. In them, Anne finds proof that her mother had never intended this future. So why, then, was everything changed behind her back? The blow of losing the keeper's title still reverberated when a quiet knock came at Anne's private quarters in Sandringham. A former lady-in-waiting to the Queen, now retired and long considered beyond palace politics, arrived bearing a simple velvet pouch. Inside it, a stack of folded parchment, faded at the edges but unmistakable in script. Anne recognized the handwriting before she even lifted the first page. These were her mother's private letters, written across decades, kept from the official archives, never copied or catalogued. It was as if the Queen had known the world would one day try to rewrite her intentions and had taken precautions only her daughter would understand. The letters were intimate, not just in tone but in what they revealed. She praised Anne's clarity, her refusal to be swayed by the court's ambitions, her brutal honesty when the palace preferred politeness. Time and again, the Queen returned to one phrase, "When the time comes, it will be you I trust to guard the truth." That phrase appeared 3 times, once underlined. There was no ambiguity. Elizabeth had made a decision, and she had anchored it not in formality, but in faith. But as Anne read deeper, an ache began to twist beneath the surface. The will, the amendment, the official document naming Camilla, it all felt colder, more distant, almost clinical. And then came the detail she couldn't ignore. The handwriting on the directive itself, the loops, the pressure points, the spacing. It wasn't Elizabeth's. Anne had read her mother's hand all her life. These strokes were mimicked, not natural. Someone had either copied her, or worse, edited a draft, quietly, deliberately. The realization didn't come as a scream. It arrived like a tide, slow, suffocating, undeniable. Something had been altered. Whether under duress, misdirection, or outright manipulation, the Queen's voice had been pushed aside. Anne had not just been cut out, she had been replaced. The trust she held so tightly, the role she had never asked for but always respected, had been stolen in plain sight. And it wasn't just about her. It was about truth, history, legacy, and what else might have been tampered with in the shadows of royal transition. Anne's heartbreak turns to suspicion, and a new question haunts her. Who really changed her mother's final decision? Camilla's influence has long been underestimated, but this moment changes everything. As Anne searches for clarity, she uncovers a hidden agreement signed between King Charles and Camilla mere days before the Queen's passing. What was promised behind closed doors, and at what cost? It began with a quiet document, buried deep within the Royal Legal Chamber's sealed drawer, marked only with the initials R.M., Emergency Protocol. Anne, now consumed by a need to understand how her mother's intentions had been overwritten, requested access to any last-minute directives processed during the Queen's final days. At first, there was resistance. The archivist stalled. Clerks hesitated. But Anne's authority, though technically diminished, still carried a weight no one dared defy outright. What she found shattered whatever illusion of coincidence remained. 48 hours before Elizabeth II took her final breath, Charles had enacted an emergency memorandum. It was precise, unannounced, and devastating in scope. The document, signed solely by Charles, with Camilla as co-authorizing witness, granted the then Queen Consort expanded council privileges, a legal maneuver not seen in over a century. It was pushed through quietly, bypassing full royal council consensus under the justification of pre-succession stability. But Anne saw it for what it was, a calculated move to shift authority before the Queen had even passed. Buried within the memorandum was a clause that made her stomach turn. The keeper of the Crown Archives, traditionally named by the monarch, could now be appointed through emergency discretion by the reigning king. With that clause, the decision was no longer Elizabeth's, it was Charles's. And Camilla had been handed that power without contest. Anne kept reading. Page after page revealed a fast-track transfer of symbolic titles, ceremonial access, and, most chilling of all, entry rights to the Windsor Vault, a place Anne knew held more than jewels and relics. It contained the Queen's personal archives, letters, voice recordings, handwritten amendments never submitted to court, documents that could confirm or expose what had truly been intended. And now, they were in Camilla's possession. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't the product of grief or chaos. It was orchestrated, surgical. The Queen had been sedated under heavy medical supervision in those final hours. There was no possibility she could have reviewed or objected to what was signed in her name. Anne hadn't just been overlooked, she had been eliminated from the plan, precisely, and without warning. And no one had even told her. No confrontation, no explanation. Just a quiet rewrite of history executed behind her back. The weight of it all crashed into Anne, not with anger, but with a cold clarity. This was no longer about legacy, it was about control. The monarchy had traded truth for maneuverability, and the woman who had stood silent through scandal after scandal was now expected to fade into the margins. But Anne had never been one to retreat. Not when there were questions left unanswered. Not when silence had been weaponized. Betrayed by blood, manipulated by politics, Anne now begins to take action. One page. That's all it takes to destabilize everything. As Anne revisits the Queen's legal testament, a gap appears in the documentation. Page 7 is gone. In its place, a photocopy, unsigned. What was on the original page, and who removed it? Haunted by the hidden memorandum and its implications, Anne turns her attention to the one place where final truth should reside. The Queen's official will. If any trace of the rightful appointments remained, it would be there. And yet, what she finds isn't just suspicious, it's surgical. The testament, housed in the Crown's legal chamber, is retrieved under strict supervision. Bound, catalogued, and guarded by the royal court's own stewards, it is expected to be flawless. But as Anne flips through the pages, her instincts tighten. The sequence is wrong. Page 6 ends mid-thought. Page 8 begins abruptly, referencing decisions that were never introduced. There is no page 7, not in its original form. In its place is a poorly scanned, barely legible photocopy, and crucially, it lacks the Queen's signature. The missing page holds specific wording that sends shockwaves through Anne's memory. It references the phrase spiritual successor, a term Elizabeth used often, but never lightly. The Queen had once said to Anne, "Titles don't define our legacy, but someone must guard what the world will never see." That line had echoed in her letters and conversations. Now it was gone from the official record. Alongside that was a second phrase Anne recognized instantly: rights of vault transference. That clause dictated who would have sovereign authority over the royal family's sealed archives, personal letters, audio confessions, and uncirculated amendments written outside public knowledge. It was a role with power far beyond ceremony, and whoever held that clause could shape the monarchy's long-term narrative. Anne demanded answers. A senior legal clerk, one who had served both her mother and father, hesitated before offering a quiet admission. The original page 7 had been seen just 2 months earlier, filed, signed, and intact. He remembered it because the Queen's handwriting on that page had included the word legacy, underlined twice. Now, it was gone. The photocopy had appeared in its place just a week after the Queen's death. No explanation was provided, no chain of custody, and the only individuals with clearance to access the will during that window, Charles, Camilla, and their private legal team. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. That same week, Camilla had been granted the vault key. Not symbolic access, full authority to retrieve, reclassify, and reallocate archival contents without requiring further council approval. Anne realized this wasn't a mishap. It was coordinated. Someone had excised the Queen's final intentions and replaced them with shadows. If the Queen had truly intended Camilla to inherit this trust, the original would have confirmed it. But someone had made sure that confirmation would never be seen. What Anne felt now wasn't rage, it was dread, because it meant there was someone inside the palace who had the access, the motive, and the protection to erase the Queen's voice. And if they could remove one page, what else had been rewritten? The more Anne uncovers, the more dangerous the silence becomes, and someone within the palace wants that silence preserved at all costs. Anne storms into the Windsor Council chamber. No press, no ceremony, just fury. In front of Charles, Camilla, William, and a stunned council of elders, she demands answers. What follows is a confrontation decades in the making, one that will redefine loyalty within the House of Windsor. The door opened, not with formality, but with force. Anne had not been summoned, she arrived by choice. The room fell silent. Every member of the Windsor Council, from high-ranking aides to senior aristocrats, looked up in quiet disbelief. She had spent weeks in near isolation, gathering pieces of a truth the palace had buried under layers of protocol. But now, she brought it to the very heart of royal power, and she didn't come to ask for clarification. She came to challenge the throne itself. Her eyes locked on Camilla first. She didn't raise her voice, didn't lash out, but her words cut sharper than any scandalous headline. Anne laid bare the sequence of events, the emergency memorandum, the missing page, the altered directive. And then she asked the question no one had ever dared to put aloud. Did you change my mother's will? Camilla, flanked by quiet legal counsel, lifted her chin and replied with a practiced calm. The Queen made peace with change. Her final days were focused on unity. But Anne wasn't interested in performance. She turned to Charles, voice trembling not from fear but from rage, held in for far too long. "Show me the original signatures," she demanded. Charles faltered. He insisted that nothing was removed, that the Queen's intent had simply evolved. But when pressed, he could not produce the full record, only summaries, copies, extracts. Not one document bore Elizabeth's unmistakable hand. Not one confirmed what Camilla now claimed as rightful inheritance. The room grew colder. William sat between them, shoulders tense, lips sealed. He didn't defend Camilla. He didn't support Anne. He said nothing. And that silence was deafening. As the confrontation escalated, Anne's voice finally cracked not from weakness, but from heartbreak. "She trusted me," she said, turning to the entire room. "She trusted me to protect the truth, and you took that from her. Camilla, still poised, replied that the monarchy had to move forward, that dwelling on old instructions only invited chaos. That was when Anne stepped back. She didn't scream. She didn't plead. She simply stared at the brother she had stood beside through every royal crisis, then turned her back. "You've made your decisions," she said. "Now live with them." She walked out, head high, as murmurs followed in her wake. But behind the scenes, a fracture had begun. Several council members, once loyal to the new regime, spoke in hushed tones of what they had just witnessed. "This wasn't right," one muttered. Another called the memorandum unlawful in spirit, if not on paper. For the first time, Anne's defiance stirred, not just sympathy, but doubt within the core of royal power. But just as Anne prepares to leave Windsor for good, a long-forgotten figure returns carrying with him the final piece of the Queen's true legacy. He vanished from the public eye years ago, but now, the Queen's former royal archivist emerges with a sealed, leather-bound case. Inside it, a copy of the Queen's uncensored final archive entry recorded 2 weeks before her death. Anne's instincts were right all along. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't a file slipped under a door or buried in a drawer. It was a man forgotten by the press, erased from the palace corridors, and dismissed without fanfare. The former royal archivist, a man who once sat silently in the background of Queen Elizabeth's most private audiences, reappeared unannounced at Anne's country residence. He had not been seen since the early weeks of Camilla's elevation, quietly let go under the guise of administrative restructuring. But now, standing before Anne with trembling hands, he offered not explanations but proof. In his possession was a sealed case, marked with the Queen's private insignia. Inside, a digital audio tape encrypted, dated, authenticated. The Queen's final archive entry. Her last recorded message before the world lost her. Anne played it in silence, the air thick with anticipation. And then the Queen's voice filled the room, calm, deliberate, and unfiltered. She spoke of legacy, of truth, of fear that her words might one day be twisted. She confirmed what Anne had always known deep down. "My legacy," the Queen said, "must be protected by someone who has no ambition, only loyalty. No one else, only Anne." It wasn't coded. It wasn't vague. It was crystal clear Elizabeth had made her choice. And the voice on that tape confirmed that nothing written afterward, no memo or directive or sudden amendment, could ever be considered her true will. The archivist had risked everything to keep that tape hidden. He had watched the changing tides in the palace, seen the shift in power, and knew that one day, the Queen's real wishes might be buried forever. But he also knew Anne. He knew she wouldn't let silence win. Alongside the tape, he had preserved a signed log, verifying the recording's time and date. It was airtight, legally admissible, unquestionable. The directive Anne had been handed weeks earlier, naming Camilla, stripping Anne of her sacred role, was a fabrication born not from truth, but from ambition. Now, Anne held more than vindication. She held the undeniable voice of the monarch herself. But with that clarity came something even heavier: power. The kind that could unravel the royal facade in seconds. Anne knew she could expose it all, present the tape, demand the restoration of her role, and shame those who had tried to erase her. But what would it cost? The monarchy was already fragile. The public didn't know the battles behind closed doors, and perhaps that had always been Elizabeth's fear. With evidence in hand, Anne now faces the ultimate question: destroy the new order or rise above it. She could expose it all: the lies, the tampering, the betrayal. But Anne, ever the stoic daughter of a queen, makes a decision that stuns even her closest allies. She chooses silence, not out of fear, but out of love for the monarchy. And in that silence, she reclaims something more powerful than any title. The truth was undeniable. Anne now held in her hands the Queen's final, unaltered wishes spoken plainly, preserved securely, and authenticated without doubt. She had the voice. She had the proof. She had the power to collapse the fragile illusion that now held the monarchy upright. One broadcast, one leak, one public statement, and the entire succession narrative would shatter. Camilla's elevation would be undone. Charles's quiet maneuvering would be dragged into light. And the institution that her mother spent 70 years protecting would crumble under the weight of its own deceit. But Anne didn't come from ambition. She came from duty, from restraint, from a generation that believed silence, when wielded correctly, could be louder than any outburst. She summoned Edward, no one else. She played the tape once more, letting him hear their mother's voice not as a princess, but as a sibling. Edward didn't speak for a long time afterward. He didn't ask what Anne planned to do. He already knew. Together, in the drawing room of her private estate, Anne placed the tape into the fireplace and lit the match herself. She watched it burn until the embers curled into ash. She wasn't surrendering the truth. She was protecting it from a world that no longer knew what to do with quiet honor. The next morning, she met with Charles. There was no fight, no fury, just 5 words that struck deeper than anything she could have exposed in public. "You've made your kingdom," she said. "You must now bear it." Charles said nothing in return. Not because he didn't have words, but because he knew they would mean nothing to her now. Anne didn't demand restoration. She didn't seek revenge. Instead, she stepped away, announcing a temporary sabbatical from royal duties, citing private reflection and family obligations. The public accepted it. The headlines spun it gently, but within palace walls, the truth echoed in silence. Everyone knew what had really happened. Weeks later, a courier arrived at Anne's residence. No note, no ceremony, just a small box containing the Queen's personal prayer book, one she had kept by her side until the very end. Anne opened it with steady hands. Inside, tucked into the spine, was a handwritten message in her mother's delicate script. "You are my true heir, not in title, but in strength." That one line said everything the will no longer could. It was her mother's final blessing, given not to the throne, but to the daughter who never asked for it, yet proved herself worthy of it in silence. But even as Anne withdraws into quiet exile, forces outside the palace prepare to break the silence she's chosen to keep. The monarchy may have tried to silence Anne, but history has a way of preserving truth. Whispers spread, rumors echo, and a new generation begins asking questions. Anne's story is not over. And one day soon, the Queen's true final wish may find its voice once again. It began, as these things always do, with a whisper. A senior Windsor staffer, long considered loyal, quietly slipped a message to a trusted journalist, not a leak of documents or a scandalous accusation, but a simple confirmation. Anne had confronted the council. She had stood before the king, the Queen consort, and her own brother William, and she had demanded to know what happened to the Queen's original will. That one sentence was all it took. The silence that had hung like a veil over Windsor began to fray. The press picked up the scent quickly. Anonymous sources claimed a royal disagreement had led to Anne's sabbatical. Speculation swirled. Had Anne been forced out? Had she resigned in protest? But the palace refused to comment, issuing only a vague statement about Anne taking time to reflect. Behind the scenes, however, something else was unfolding. Catherine, Princess of Wales, arrived at Anne's private estate under the radar. No cameras, no press. The visit lasted only an hour. No official record was released. But what was exchanged in that quiet meeting would echo far louder than any headline. Anne gave Catherine the Queen's prayer book. The same one that had held the handwritten note, the quiet declaration of who Elizabeth believed her true heir to be, not in title, but in strength. Catherine said nothing publicly. But from that moment forward, her presence in the royal narrative began to shift quieter, more deliberate, and weighted with new meaning. Elsewhere, a royal historian known for his unwavering loyalty to the crown requested access to the Queen's legal archive. He had begun comparing draft versions of the will, noting inconsistencies in phrasing, signature placement, and dates. The request was denied. Twice. And yet, he persisted, hinting in academic circles that something critical may have been lost between draft and final. The rumour, once seeded, could not be pulled out by force. It began to grow quietly, relentlessly. Anne, for her part, remained silent. She did not return to royal duty. She did not grant interviews. But in stepping back, she had done something the monarchy didn't expect. She had become myth. A quiet force. A question that wouldn't go away. Because power, when stripped of honour, leaves a vacuum. And in that vacuum, stories thrive. The world may never know what truly broke Anne's heart, but in the quiet corridors of the palace, the truth still lingers, waiting, watching, ready to rise again. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.